Well, and the prospect for a good living is good. If you try to gain the rights you know you should have, you'll be threatening your chance to get an education and to enjoy the comforts of that life. And you may threaten what your family has accomplished over decades of hard work. You might succeed, but you might make things worse for yourself and for those you love. Do you take up the struggle for equality or not? Now imagine that you're a sharecropper in Alabama or Mississippi, working hard every day to get a few dollars from the land that a white person owns. You know you can try to register to vote, even though you might not pass the test that you're given asking you to interpret some obscure bit of the state constitution. But if you even try to register, the landowner is likely to kick you off your farm, and then how can you live? How can you continue to feed your family? Do you dare try to register? Along with my wife Jane, I had the privilege to consider these questions and many others by participating in a tour of civil rights historic sites called the Living Legacy Pilgrimage. We visited Selma, where the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights got organized. And we marched in meditation 2 by 2 across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We visited Montgomery and sat in the kitchen chair where Martin Luther King Jr. sat to contemplate his heavy burden. We walked through the park in Birmingham, Alabama, where police used fire hoses and raging dogs to oppose the demonstrators. Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were killed. Jackson, where Medgar Evers was assassinated and much organizing for human rights took place. Oxford, where James Meredith registered to enter Ole Miss, which started a riot of white protesters. And Memphis, where Martin Luther King himself was killed. But we didn't merely visit places. We met and spoke with dozens of veterans of the civil rights movement, heard their stories, received their inspiration, and sang with them. Let me share a few of the stories we heard. Soon after the young preacher Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Montgomery to become minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white bus passenger. We all know this story. A bus boycott followed, organized by blacks of Montgomery, and after an entire year they prevailed. Segregation of public buses in Montgomery was gone. But on our civil rights tour, Jane and I learned more. For example, we learned about the task of organizing rides so the blacks could continue their employment. Now, running a taxi service required a public local license from the city. And whites, of course, ran the city, so there was no chance to get taxi licenses. There still needed, though, to be coordination for all the pickups and drop-offs. How could this be done while resisting the lawsuits filed by the city claiming that the blacks were in fact operating a taxi service? Quickly, the coordination centered around Dean's Drugstore, a local black-operated store run by a family whose house was 2 doors down from the parsonage where Martin Luther King and his family lived, a couple blocks from the Dexter Avenue Church. The daughter of the Dean family, who grew up with the Kings, told us about the meetings most nights in the attic of their house, with King and her parents planning the next day's rides. More important, no doubt, we learned about the cost of leadership for King and for others, and we had a chance to imagine ourselves in their shoes. One night, shortly after the boycott began, when King was at the church, he got a message. His house had just been bombed, and Coretta and their daughter were inside. King rushed back home to assure himself that they were all right. We visited the parsonage and saw the impact of the bomb on the front porch, still plainly visible today. A few weeks later, at 2 or 3 in the morning, King and his family were asleep when the phone rang. Now remember, there's no caller ID, there's no voicemail, none of this stuff. The phone rang at 2 or 3 in the morning. King had become accustomed to getting hate calls at all hours. he picked up the phone and heard yet another threat against the lives of his family. He went to the kitchen and sat down at the table, fixing himself some coffee and wondering if he could continue with what had become an almost impossible burden. The story is that as he asked himself the question, he felt a presence that assured him he was on the right course and he should press on in his campaign for equal treatment. The event is called the Epiphany in the stories of the boycott. In our tour of the parsonage, we came into the living room, the bedroom, and the small hallway where the phone was, and still is. Almost everything in the parsonage is original to the king's use of the house, since the church owned the house and provided it furnished to their minister. We saw the 1950s style phone and moved to the kitchen. There, with the lights off, the woman who runs the King Parsonage invited us, one at a time, to sit in Martin Luther King's kitchen chair in front of his Melmac dishes and stainless steel table settings. We sat down in the chair, challenged ourselves to imagine the pressure on King and how we would respond if it became ours. How would we have found the courage to continue? It was a deeply spiritual moment for me to sit there. Could I have endured? How would I have been able to move events in order to bend toward justice? Another story. The famous voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery actually started, in a way, in Marion, Alabama in February 1965. There, a peaceful crowd met to start a one-block march from a church to the jail where a civil rights worker was being held. As people left the church, the police formed a line and started to attack the marchers. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old graduate of college and ordained minister with a promising career, fled from the police into a cafe behind the church with his mother and 82-year-old grandfather. Police chased after them and started beating the old man. Jimmy Lee and his mother tried to protect the grandfather, trying to stop the blows of the police. One trooper shot Jimmy Lee twice in the stomach, but they kept attacking him with clubs. He died in the hospital a few days later. At a rally called To Mourn Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Bevel, a young civil rights worker trained in nonviolent resistance, called, impulsively actually, to commemorate Jackson's death by marching 50 miles from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery to demand the right to vote. A few days later, Bevel, John Lewis, Diane Nash, and a few others who had been trained together led a group of marchers out of Brown Memorial Chapel in Selma, through town and over the Edmund G. Pettus Bridge, walking east toward Montgomery. As they proceeded down the far side of the bridge, they saw a line of Alabama state troopers blocking their way. They were ordered to stop, but they kept walking, slowly and deliberately. The troopers responded by clubbing and beating the demonstrators, chasing them back across the bridge, back into Selma, back even to the steps of Brown Chapel. That was Bloody Sunday, but the event was captured on news film. The attack on the demonstrators was headline news. Martin Luther King, who had initially declined to join Bevel's call for a march, knew now he had to be there. He called ministers from around the country to gather in Selma, white and black. A few hundred ministers responded. Several days of tense negotiations began, trying to get federal court approval for the march. On Tuesday night, when tensions were highest among the demonstrators, they met again at Brown Chapel, with growing bitterness among them. Among the ministers at Brown Chapel were Unitarian Universalists. Three of them, James Reeb, Clark Olson, and Orloff Miller, were friends, and they went to dinner together. After dinner, a few yards from the restaurant, a group of whites attacked the three ministers. The Reverend James Reeb was mortally wounded, dying later in a Montgomery hospital. Now, a few days after that, the march proceeded. By now, James Reeb was a martyr, a hero. The pressure on Congress mounted, and within 2 or 3 months, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, perhaps the most important legislation for equal rights in our history. As part of our pilgrimage, we went to Marion, Alabama, and sat in the church where Jimmy Lee Jackson sat with his mother and grandfather. 6 civil rights veterans told us the story of that night. We went to Jackson's gravesite along the roadside outside of town, riddled now with bullet holes. Traveling on to Selma, we saw civil rights sites around town and met folks who were there. We went to Brown Chapel and sat in the pews, stood up at the podium. We walked silently and slowly across the Pettus Bridge. Most movingly, the Reverend Clark Olson himself, who was part of our pilgrimage, told the stories of being with James Reeb as they dined, as they started to walk back from the dinner, and as they traveled by ambulance to the hospital. Clark told us the last dying words of James Reeb. We cried, and we mourned the cost of justice. But we also asked questions. What does it take to move our hearts and to feel the suffering of others? How can we mobilize public opinion when a determined minority can block progress? And why was it the death of the white minister James Reeb that mobilized the nation, that forced Congress to act, and not the death of the black minister, Jimmy Lee Jackson? We experience these feelings and ask these questions several times each day during the pilgrimage. Stories abound from many persons whom we met, stories dating back to the 1950s and 60s, and those happening today in the South, people seeking justice and fairness, sacrificing for the cause of equality. We must learn and pass on those stories. Where's the order of service? Where's the order of service? Here it is. The image on today's order of service is Sankofa. From West Africa, the principle of Sankofa is to find and keep the stories and experiences of the past, using them to make the future better. Hold them and share them. The stories we learned on our Living Legacy pilgrimage remind us of the courage, forbearance, and hope of past heroes, the same qualities we need to lend to our own efforts in our own day. Toward the end of the tour, I challenged myself. If I were in the South of the 1950s and 60s, I frankly do not know if I would have found the strength to join the fight. If I would have made the choice to risk the advantages I had in order to secure equal rights. Very possibly, I would have not. If I were black, I might have stayed in my comfort zone, living with the slights and insults of racism in order not to lose what I already had. If I were white, I might have lived with the knowledge of deep injustice for others in order not to risk my comfort and my place. Maybe I would have decided to donate money or do something else that would have not put myself at too big a risk. I don't know. But I do know this. Being among other committed people makes me stronger. Facing a challenge on my own is one thing, but facing it together with others is different. We find courage among other courageous people. Together we make each other more willing to take the risk. King himself might not have stayed in the struggle, but King, along with Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth and others, made a powerful combination. And so did those who went to Selma. About 2 weeks ago, Bill Clinton spoke on the 50th anniversary of the death of Medgar Evers, the Mississippi civil rights leader, assassinated in the driveway of his home in Jackson. Clinton said, and I didn't find the exact quote, but he said in effect, that it's easy to celebrate the campaigns for justice in the past once the controversy they faced has been resolved. Everyone now agrees that civil rights for African Americans is right, or practically everyone, but it's much more difficult to be willing to stand up for what is right before that rightness is so clear. What are the battles today that call for us to stand up and be counted? Those are the issues that we must find a way to be involved in. Those are the struggles that we must consider just how much we are called to join. The fight for marriage equality and LGBTQ rights. The fight for justice for transgendered people who are victims of violence. Justice for immigrants and their families. Issues about the rights of women. The threat of gun violence in our cities and our schools. The fight against economic inequality that has grown so much in recent years, and the need to establish sustainable use of resources and environmental justice. We find the courage we need from the stories of courageous people in the past and from each other. I end with just one more story, another bit of Sankofa. I ask that we sing hymn number 149 this morning, Lift Every Voice and Sing. As you know, this has been called the Negro National Anthem. Written by James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond Johnson in 1900. The words of this hymn are tragic, but still hopeful. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. It urges us to continue in the struggle. In its own words, let us march on till victory is won. At the close of the hymn, the prayer is this: may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. These African American pioneers and civil rights leaders were both Negro and American, pledged both to their people and to the country we share. Singing that hymn almost always makes me cry. On our pilgrimage, we went to First Baptist Church in Montgomery, which was Ralph Abernathy's church. Abernathy was King's close friend and greatest ally. At First Baptist, we were welcomed by older members who were there in the 1950s and 60s, and especially by Dorothy Posey Jones, the music director emerita. She told us her stories and then played this hymn on the organ. She had played this hymn for Abernathy. She had played it for King. She had played it during the bus boycott meetings. And now she was playing it for us. There were no dry eyes in the house that day. So when we come to 149, stand as you are willing and able and join in singing, lift every voice and sing. If you tear up as I will, let it come. But keep singing loudly and joyously. Let it be so. And amen.